Hello. Thanks a lot to the Finnish authorities for the invitation. And I'm going to give you an EU perspective. Therefore, I'm going to think along the 4 lines that you can see on the screen. But first of all, 2 examples to illustrate what I will try to explain. In 2013, you can read different press releases from the European institutions saying that the common European asylum system was finalized and in place. 2 years after, of course, the crisis of 2015 came up. In 2016, we have legislative proposals from the European Commission in order to revise the legislative framework in the area of asylum. Exactly the contrary of what was said in 2013. 2013, the common European asylum system is in place. We just need to take care of implementation. We do not need any more legislations. 3 years after, exactly the contrary with legislative proposals. In 2016, a regulation has been adopted also as a kind of response to the crisis, aiming at the creation of a European border and coast guard. The problem is, what is a European border and coast guard? Not an easy question and a complex answer given if you read the regulation, knowing that it should be in charge of integrated border management and that the aim is to put in place an integrated system for the management of external borders following the treaties under Article 77. So, 2 notions, common European asylum system, European border and coast guard, and I think that they show that we are not really clear about what we mean and the goals that we want to achieve. And actually, I propose to go back to 1999, when the temporary conclusions were adopted at a famous summit, as you know, organized by Finland and especially devoted to justice and home affairs. A very interesting and important text which is still relevant nowadays, and that's quite rare about Council conclusions that almost 20 years after they are still extremely relevant. And I pick up one very important notion in those conclusions, the idea that what we need is to put in place common policies for migration, asylum, borders and visas. Common policies. Not only policies, but common policies. And there are not so many policies when you look at EU treaties where this idea is used. So you can try to give a specific meaning to that notion coming out of the treaties. And actually, I propose you as a brainstorming exercise to look at 4 components that are part of that notion. First, if you want to have a common policy, you need to have a common framework. Secondly, common implementation, common funding, and then also a common external view of the area. So, let me first look at the common framework, and actually a common legislative framework. And this, of course, refers to the idea that the solution to most of the problems that we face is new legislation. Something that is a common idea shared by many persons in Brussels, in the capital of the European Union, but also at national level. In many countries, the idea is that new legislation to solve it. And actually, when you look at what has been achieved on paper, legally, well, it is rather impressive. Regarding borders and visa policies, we have adopted codes as regulations, and those rules replace national rules totally. They become automatically part of national law, so that actually you do not even have almost Finnish rules on the visa policy or Finnish rules on borders. Most of those rules, if not almost all of them, are have been adopted at EU level. Regarding asylum, I already mentioned that actually we thought that the work at legislative level was finished. Now we are examining a third legislative package on the basis of Commission proposal tabled in 2016. Actually, the area which is still incomplete is migration, and in particular legal migration, where we have a limited number of directives. There are still holes. Labor migration is to a large part not covered, and those directives represent in general a very low level of harmonization. What is on the agenda for the moment is still the revision of the so-called blue card adopted in 2009 for the admission of highly skilled workers. A fake blue card adopted in 2009 that we now really try to turn into a real blue card, including mobility rights for third country nationals. And there is also undergoing what is called a fitness check, meaning a revision of all the directives in place in that area in order to see if they are coherent or incoherent, if there are gaps or overlaps, and what to do. And probably that the outcome of this exercise within 1 or 2 years will be the proposal by the Commission of a code on legal migration. But that code would still reflect the existing situation, so a low level of harmonization and some holes regarding, in particular, legal migration. If you want, the idea to make cheese, but when you don't have enough ingredients, you will still have enough holes in that cheese, and that will probably be the outcome of that exercise. So a question about that. Regarding a common policy, do we really know what we need to achieve in common regarding legislation on legal migration in the European Union? What is the added value that we expect from that legislation? There were attempts of the European Commission in 2001 regarding labour migration, but when you look at the motives, they were rather poor. And in a nutshell, it was, why do you harmonize? Well, because there is a need for harmonization, which is not a clear answer, and I think a very bad answer in terms of subsidiarity. Let's also keep in mind that actually when the Schengen area was created with the idea to abolish internal border controls, which was at the core of it, the necessary compensatory measures that have been adopted concern the visa policy for short-term admission and external borders, not migration as such, meaning admission for more than 3 months. So it means that even the authors of the Schengen area thought that it was not necessary to have a common policy for migration as admission of more than 3 months. So I think we should really think about that because there is a lack of understanding of what is needed and what we want to achieve at EU level, unless you think that you need to act at EU level. Why? Well, because you want to do it, which is not a good answer, an insufficient answer following EU law. If you think about the common framework on asylum, well, it seems that we are going to stick upon the solution that we try to implement since 20 years, and in particular the Dublin regulation. It doesn't work since 20 years, but we are going once again to have a fourth Dublin regulation relying on the same principles that we are unable up to date to implement. Now we are told that sanctions will be taken against asylum seekers if they don't play the game, in a nutshell, if they don't stay in the responsible country for the examination of their asylum claim. Is that realistic? One can really doubt that sanctions will be sufficient and that people will be really afraid about that. Now, to go further, a common legislative framework is, of course, necessary. I don't deny that. It is a precondition which is necessary. The problem is that it is not sufficient. Because, of course, legislation is nothing if there is no implementation of that legislation. And actually, the crisis that we passed through in 2015 is a very good example where all the legislation that was adopted by the EU regarding asylum collapsed, was not applied by most of the member states for several reasons. I do not enter into details about that. One may wonder why we had that crisis, what type of crisis it was. I don't think that it was a crisis about numbers. It was, I think, mainly a crisis because of the bad institutional organization of the European Union. Because we are at a moment where there is a transition from a national system towards a more European system, and we are in the middle, where neither the member states, neither the European Union can face the challenges that we have. And then we turn out to face actually a kind of disaster where all the member states react as they think, as they want, and this was what was called the wave-through approach. Most of the member states were actually letting the people passing through their borders and going to other member states till the moment a solution was found with Turkey, and also in the same time the flows from Turkey through Greece diminished. So actually we need to think about a common implementation, and this is my second point. Why do we need common implementation? Well, because legislation is necessary but insufficient. Think of asylum and borders. We have legislation. It is supposed to be implemented by the member states, but it is not. Either not at all, or either in a bad way, but certainly not in the same way. So we need more common implementation. This is, of course, a big change, because if you think of the basic rule in EU law, well, it is what is called indirect administration. Up to date, the basic rule of EU law is that the member states are supposed to implement EU legislation. The EU makes legislation, that's the most important task of the European Union institutions, and the member states are supposed to implement in reality those legislation. That's the rule which is called indirect administration under EU law, meaning that actually the EU has a very limited administration because it's simply mainly not in charge of implementing policies. So actually, when you think, this leads us about the executive power. Now, when you look a bit more into details at EU level, you see that what kind of executive power we have is not clear, and less clear than regarding how we make legislation. Regarding legislative power, we found a solution how to share power between the member states and EU institutions, and this is the so-called ordinary legislative method, also called co-decision, meaning a decision taken by the European Parliament, representing the European population, together with the Council of Ministers, which is the second chamber representing the member states. And that's a clear model of making legislation at EU level. Think about executive power, the picture is less clear. The principle is, of course, as I said, implementation by member states. But you have exceptions. It can be implementation at EU level. And then normally it is by the Commission, following the famous so-called comitology procedures and the idea of implementing acts. But you can also have cases where executive power is retained by the Council. And then you even have a third solution where executive power is given to agencies. And I'm going to speak quite a lot about agencies a little bit later. So we don't have a clear picture for the moment about executive power in the European Union. We have several solutions, and we don't know which is the best one. But what is rather clear when you think in terms of implementation is that regarding at least borders and asylum, we cannot continue as we are supposed to do now. We cannot continue with implementations of legislation by member states, simply. That answer is not anymore valid. Why? Well, because we have what are called asymmetric challenges, meaning that the burden between EU member states is not distributed in an equal way. That's a very well-known phenomenon, but we have member states that are located at the external borders of the European Union, at the east and at the south, and they are supposed to control the border of the Schengen area for the others. The same for asylum. They are supposed to actually to be responsible under the Dublin system for asylum applications, which is never or rarely applied in practice up to now. And then they go to other member states, and there also you don't have an unequal share of the burden between states. So we need to find another system for the implementation of EU law, because the classical answer, implementation by member states, doesn't work anymore. So then, of course, is what can we do? Well, I think that the crisis gives us a very interesting example of what could be what I call a European integrated administration. And why integrated? Well, because it is an integration of a European administration, agencies, with the national administration, and they work together. So the idea is not at all to replace member states' organs by a federal agency, but on the contrary, to build a system where actually the national administration is still in place, but it is supposed to collaborate for the implementation with the EU administration, meaning agencies. And actually those agencies should be in the driving seat. There is a kind of hierarchy, because they really lead the policy, and the member states still implement on the ground, but they are supposed to follow the guidelines and the instruction given by EU agencies. And actually this becomes reality. It's not always very well known, but if you look to what's happening in hotspots in Greece, Greek law has been changed in order to allow experts of the European Asylum Support Office, the asylum agency, to be part of the Greek procedure for the examinations of asylum applications. And in particular, the admissibility is done by experts deployed by the European Asylum Support Office. Well, not legally, because they are not supposed to take a decision, but in reality they do. And the admissibility kind of not decision but opinion given by EU experts is endorsed or rubber stamped by the Greek administration. And I think that this model shows us what the future could be, a kind of common implementations for policies when it is needed. And the answer is not the same for all policies. I don't speak here about legal migration. I speak here in particular for external borders and for the asylum policy. Of course, the model that we see emerging is still ambiguous, because we still think and pretend that actually this is not the normal situation and that we will go back to the basic principles implementation by member states, and in particular regarding asylum, back to the Dublin system. And we have even now included a threat against member states who would not be able to play the rules of the game and to respect them. It is the exclusion of the Schengen area, which is now black and white in the new regulation on the European on the European border guards. So we see, I think, with the crisis emerging a new type of EU administration made of EU agencies and national administration, and I think that this is a solution for the future, and a very interesting element of hope coming out from the crisis. And this leads me to my third element. If you want a common policy, you do not need only a common legislative framework, common rules, a kind of common implementation, but you need also a type of common funding, or a certain level of financial solidarity, or solidarity which can take other forms like operational or technical solidarity. I will come back to that point. But again, the starting point is who should fund the implementation of EU policies on migration, visas, borders and asylum. Well, the member states, they are in charge of implementation, so logically they are also in charge of the funding. Now, when you look at what does exist at EU law, we see that it's not exactly like that, because we have EU funds that have been created. You have, for instance, what is called the AMIF, the Asylum, Migration and Integration Fund. And then you have also the Internal Security Fund, which is supposed to channel some EU money to the member states regarding the borders and visa policies. But then the question is, why do you have that type of EU funding? Why is that necessary? And this is not so clear when you read the regulations. You don't know if it is for really initiatives with an EU added value, or if it is just supplementary money given to the member states, and to a certain extent based on the idea of solidarity, so that you redistribute money between the member states in order to take into consideration that they face asymmetric burdens. What happened during the crisis is also, I think, a good illustration of the fact that that system doesn't work anymore. What can we witness during the crisis? Well, we saw Commissioner Avramopoulos going around Europe and signing checks with EU, giving EU money to member states on the basis of emergency funding. But emergency funding was about sometimes the basic needs of member states that they were supposed to cover. So it shows that the system doesn't function anymore as it should function. And then I take another example, of course, a very provocative one. I am aware of that, but I think that there is something behind the demand of Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, when he said to the EU, I want half of the money that I spent to build a wall around Hungary to be reimbursed by the European Union, because actually that wall protects not only Hungary of illegal entrance, but also the other Schengen member states. Of course, it looks very provocative, and in many member states we don't want to listen to that kind of requests. Some people even will first say, well, a wall is illegal. Sorry, when you look at EU law, you don't find any clear indication that building a wall at the border would be illegal. It is possible. Of course, what is requested is doors into that wall. And at those doors, people need to be treated in a certain way and following certain rules. But as such, the idea of building a wall instead of putting border guards along the border is not illegal. And this leads us to, again, a question of implementation. We do not implement controls of external borders, surveillance of border more precisely, in the same way. Some member states invest a lot, others invest not that much. Some invest in border guards, others build walls. Others invest in equipment, and you can have very sophisticated equipment to survey the borders. So there again, we see that we lack a common implementation. But behind this question, there is also the issue of funding. So, why should actually Hungary pay for controlling the border, while it is not a border that is only an Hungarian border, but also a European border? Even here, legally and politically, we don't know anymore what are the external borders. Are they national? Are they European? Well, they are a mixture of both. But it's easy to understand that we cannot continue to live in a system where borders are supposed to be controlled and the funding should come from member states. This will not last in the future. And actually, we see that the solution coming out from the crisis is interesting from that point of view, because actually agencies represent a kind of operational solidarity between member states. And even you can say at the end it is a type of financial solidarity between the member states, because actually the salaries of the experts deployed by Frontex or by DEASO are still paid by the member states. Only the other costs are covered by the agencies. So actually agencies do represent a kind of solidarity and a type of the answer what we need. And even a very interesting solution, because it's very flexible. Because actually those agencies, they do not replace national administration in all member states, only where it is necessary. For the moment, in particular in Greece, to a certain extent in Italy, maybe tomorrow in Romania, if a new road really takes shape. So I think that again we see that agencies are a very interesting idea to share the burden. Now, of course, the question is the proportion. And there we don't have a clear view. Nobody knows, nobody can tell you what is the total cost supported by member states to control the external borders of the European Union per member state, and then you should agglomerate that and then divide that following criteria. This is the type of discussion that I think we will have in the future, despite the fact we don't like the way the question is asked by Viktor Orban. It will, I think, be on the agenda. And then to finish, the fourth point is the common external dimension. And actually there, well, as you are probably aware, this is the only solution that we found to the crisis. As we could not agree internally how to share asylum seekers between the member states, well, we decided to externalize the crisis and to try to push the burden, to shift the burden to third countries with a certain level, nevertheless, of burden sharing. And actually, this time what we can see is that externalizations becomes a reality. After what I would say a decade of paperwork and discourse behind the idea of the global approach to migration. A lot of paperwork that didn't lead to many results and was poorly implemented. Now we see that the EU is managing to implement some solutions in a more or less effective way. I refer, of course, to the declaration signed by the EU and Turkey about the fact. Actually, we asked the Turks to prevent people to leave their territory towards Greece, and this led to the closure of what was called the Balkan Road. The second example is what we, for the moment, try to achieve in Libya, which is extremely interesting because actually, again, the idea is the same. Prevent people to leave the Libyan territory so that actually we don't have any more to deal with those persons. It's of course very complicated because legally we have to avoid any kind of responsibility or jurisdiction, and this means that then we cannot ourselves intercept migrants or asylum seekers on their way to the EU, otherwise we become responsible, otherwise the European Convention, the European Charter do apply. So all our effort is that to make sure that the job is done by the Libyan Coast Guard. So we are not responsible legally. Morally, that's of course a total different story, but legally we are not responsible for the fact that people are not allowed to leave. Now to finish, the question is this a sustainable model? Is that even a model for the future? Well, there of course we easily understand that such answer puts the EU into danger because we become very much dependent upon the policy of third countries. Turkey today, Libya tomorrow. Also, we include more and more migration management into development policy. But then the question is, what is development? Do we really contribute to development when we give money to third countries to increase border controls and to prevent departure or transit through their territory? And what about what is called the so development hump? The idea that actually more development leads to more migration at a certain stage. And this is probably what will happen even if we manage to develop some African countries. This will not lead immediately to less migration, but for a certain period to more migration. So actually we see that we can have serious doubts about the fact, about the idea of the adequateness of that answer. And of course it's rather natural to think that it's not in line with the idea of globalization and increased mobility without even speaking of demography. Because we all know that actually we will have population decreasing and aging in the EU, and we have still a boom of population into Africa. And if you ask demographers, they will tell you that following history, there will be people will move, like it or not, in the next decades because of that. So to finish, just to say that we have to reinvent for mobility for the 21st century. For the moment, what the EU is now trying to do is to protect itself of migration. But we can wonder if this is really the adequate response, and we have to keep in mind that what we really miss are common policies. Too much legislation, not enough common implementation, not enough solidarity between member states. And I think I will leave you with this point with the hope to having given you some food for thought. Thank you very much.